This part of our video about Without Benefit of Clergy will talk about the post-colonial aspects of the story and how we can connect that with some of the post-colonial theory we talked about earlier this week. So, certainly one of the themes that is there right from the very beginning is the idea of women as commodities of empire. And to my mind, there are two kinds of commodities. Women are commodities both as Amira is bought and paid for by a British man who wants to have a mistress on the side. He wants something a little more home-like and be safe from sexually transmitted diseases. So he gets a very young girl who has no other sexual experience and pays for her, actually pays her mother what he calls a dowry, but we know is really just a price for him to be able to have her exclusively for his own pleasure. I would venture to say that women, the company also did something similar. He is taking care of his needs, his personal sexual needs that way. But the company did something similar in advertising for women to come out to India to find husbands or to work in various capacities. And so even British women were also commodities of empire, I think. I want to talk a little bit about Englishmen who, as they say, went native. Going native was something that we have seen. If you've read Heart of Darkness, you know that Kurtz, the European trader, went even further in terms of brutality than any of the tribes that he lived among. He was savage with a vengeance. We'll also talk about ethnocentrism, or the belief that my culture is best in the story, and we'll talk a little bit about resistance in the story, because there's that too. So in terms of folks going native, as it were, in this text, I'm going to adjust the frame a little bit here. Maybe. There. Here in the first picture, we see officers of the East India Company, so this would be pre-1857, pre the Sepoy Rebellion, watching a cultural entertainment. I'm not sure if it's dancing, or it certainly looks like it's music there, but they are watching this entertainment in a room full of Indians. And it wasn't unusual in the early days of the East India Company for members of the company or soldiers who worked for the company to take Indian wives and marry them, as well. And some British men even had whole harems of women, married multiple women in the Muslim fashion. On the other hand, we have British soldiers who wore, who commanded. This man is a British officer who commands Indians, because the troops in India, while there were British soldiers, low-class, working-class British soldiers who came and soldiered in India, many of the soldiers who protected British interests and who did the police work for the various native states that engaged the British to do administrative work for them, many of those soldiers were actually Indian themselves, but their officers were always Britons. And so here we have a British man who is dressed up in an Indian uniform, because his troops are made up of Indian, native Indian, indigenous Indian soldiers. what does this mean in terms of our story? Um, I would venture to say that Holden has gone native to some, at least some little degree. Here he has set up a love nest that is clearly um, not an English type of household. He doesn't dictate that Amira eat English food. She at one point says that she is wearing English clothes to make him think of her more as an English woman, so he won't be tempted to look at other English women and leave her discarded. He really loves her, and he professes that he would never ever do that. The fact that he has sought out an Indian mistress and goes to live with her when he's not on duty suggests that in fact he is, to a certain extent, going native. He's not demanding that she follow his customs. When she says that she wants to avoid the evil eye, he agrees that they should not tempt fate, as it were, by talking about their happiness anymore, because God will take it away. That's totally her idea, but he agrees with it, and to that extent I think he's going native. The other British administrators, again, if they have wives, those wives are not going to permit them to act like the Indians act. They are going to want them to maintain British culture for the sake of their families and children. But it's really clear, as we've said before, that women are commodities of empire, and this works both ways. So British women who come out and raise their children in India are certainly commodities. They are there in India to encourage their husbands, again, very much the angel in the house pattern, the separate spheres. They are there to raise children, yes, but unlike in Britain, those children, most couples sent their children back to England for schooling, so boarding schools were very important as places where the children of parents working in India might be sent, because it was believed that the climate in India, after children were past babyhood, if they survived babyhood, and were, they had to be old enough to be able to take care of themselves somewhat to be sent back to England, so they wouldn't be sent before they were 7 or 8 years old. But the idea is that British mothers would give their children the basics. They would have ayahs. Here are the ayahs, the baby nurses here taking care of this English child. And so, again, many of the nurses weren't able to marry and have their own families because they were needed for the care and moderation of the British children. And so that's a way in which they became a commodity of empire too. On the right, we do have an example of a beautiful Indian woman who did in fact marry a British lieutenant colonel in the armed forces. She herself was a noblewoman. She was not a common working class Indian woman at all. And so that might, her successful union and being seen as, it being seen that it was valuable for her to marry one of the British elite, an elite officer, might make more sense. And certainly, because she was noble, he could be proud of her as well. But ethnocentrism is certainly present at every turn. The British, when they brought their families, again, the women were the instigators here. The British were The women required that things in India move along much as they would in middle-class Great Britain. Of course, why did middle-class men come out to India and bring their families out? Because, in fact, they needed that job in India in order to make money to live comfortably when they retired back in England. There were not those kinds of jobs available to them in England, and so it really was a money-making operation. You came to India because you did not have either the money to do well at home in Britain, or you wanted to make money. But importing the British ladies meant that they demanded that life in India be very much like Britain. Here we see the native servants holding the horses, and we see the British drinking their tea, much as they would back in Britain. Here is Christmas in India, around 1890, and we see the domestic sphere. We see the ayah back here taking care of the blonde child. We see a punkawalla pulling the fan by hand, and over here we see another house servant bringing a tray of drinks to celebrate the holiday. And again, this, without the servants in the picture, this could easily be a scene at home. The British were very, very anxious to create a scene, to create a society in India that mirrored what they knew at home. Was there resistance to this idea of British ethnocentrism? Absolutely. Amira's resistance is in the form of she was anxious to have a son. She was anxious to be able to give Holden a son because she believed that would mean he would be indebted to her forever. That if he had a son, he would not desert her. I'm not sure that her rationale there is accurate. There were plenty of Indian mistresses who were deserted by the men who had used them. But it does seem, in the context of the story, that her relationship with Holden was definitely a love match. And so maybe her fear is not justified at all. Another form of resistance, what makes the Member of Parliament for Lower Tooting leave is the climate and the threat of disease. He thinks he knows what India is all about. He comes out to India without ever having really been there. And this was kind of an ideology of the civil servants, that unless you've been in India for quite a while, you have no right to say anything about what it's really like. And the member for Tooting, the person sitting next to him on the boat, passes out and dies from cholera within a very short time. And that scares him so much that he never says anything else about giving the vote to Indians. Which, again, from the inception of the Congress Party, Indians were concerned about getting rid of British administration. There was a rapidly rising educated class of Indians who had gone to mission schools, some who had been educated in England itself. Their wealthy parents had sent them to learn what the English knew so they could come back and govern India themselves. And certainly there was political resistance. But I think in the story, it's interesting that The climate and the threat of disease seems to be the primary resistance. So let's summarize. Certainly, the story tells us that women could be bought and sold as commodities by colonial elites, but although this sounds very harsh and clinical, in fact, probably many men, like Holden, really loved their Indian concubines, really, and were deeply committed to them. Again, Holden doesn't tell anybody about Amira, and I think we have to assume it's because he knows that he would be shunned by the other European men if he tried to bring Amira to parties and pass her off as an equal to the British ladies who come out to India. What's interesting in the story, and what really comes across, is that Amira thinks it's an honor. Her mother certainly thinks it's an honor for an English man to have an Indian mistress. It's considered an honor for that woman and her family. Of course, that's not how the British women see it. They see this as sin, fornication, an evil thing, and that children who are born from unions between Indians and Britons are half-castes. They are people who have no claim on the British world and no claim on the Indian world. In fact, India was much kinder to people who were what are now called Anglo-Indians, people who have half British and half Indian ancestry. The British community's ethnocentrism, the belief that British culture was best, would never permit Indian wives to be accepted in British society. That's very clear. While, as I said, the Anglo-Indian children were only accepted by the Indians, not the British. And I think, sadly, this story really shows the irony of covert British liaisons with Indian women. The irony in several ways, that these liaisons could be more loving and more equal than traditional British marriages. Also ironic because they could disappear so completely, just as the house is knocked down and the timbers taken away to be sold, and there be nothing left of these liaisons. And certainly, writing about a subject like this, about a British man having an Indian mistress, was taking a chance in 1890s Britain, because certainly admitting that there was sexual activity outside of marriage was not something that the Victorian public would be wild about. But again, because Amira is Indian, it's considered that her morals would probably be low anyway, and so there's not a problem with talking, as long as she doesn't live, as long as she doesn't come home with him and want to be set up in a house in London, it's okay. So sadly, the problem of what to do with this Indian mistress when he goes back to England is solved for him because she dies. And so this kind of fatalistic, there is no hope at this point in time for British society to accept Indians, even if they're much beloved. They can't be full members of British society.